there is this magic touch which Maestro has, because people, the moment they hear it's Carlisle's new work, it's Carlisle's new work based on a well-known play and a well-known film, you know, for people in our line of work, your ears just prick up and just go, how can I get this gig?
For me, that's the most exciting project that could ever come across your plate. And when Michael asked me, I was absolutely thrilled. I've designed a lot of new musicals and plays, so for me, it's thrilling to be designing something new. I much prefer when it's more challenging. It can also be much more rewarding. It's a world premiere, so to me, that's the most exciting thing. When you see that time period, it is overwrought with these crazy shapes and trimmings and bows and men in enormous wigs, and the men are almost really more elaborate than the women are. So trying to take such an elaborate time period and put it on a body and not have it seem so odd to today's eyes, that really is a challenge. A lot of that is scale, color, and getting the shapes right on a modern body, and then for a modern viewer, that is probably the most challenging. To have it so it feels lush and correct without being comical. So that, I think, is probably one of the most challenging things.
My role as a set designer is to provide the scenery, which is sort of the, I guess, the architecture of the piece, and also the props, all the furniture, little like lamps, rugs, and then obviously the walls too. It's a quiet show with mostly with two people on stage at a time, so I'm trying to keep the scenery less intrusive while evoking lots of different places. I think that was my biggest challenge, and hopefully everyone likes it.
It's almost out. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fourth installment of our series, Masters at Work. I'm Mark Skorka, president of Opera America, and we are so honored to be hosting this five-part series as we track the birth and development and now premiere of an opera by the great master of American opera, Carlisle Floyd. As I noted, the opera premiered just last week, and we have an opportunity now to think about it, having experienced the entire work, rather than just talking about it theoretically. As always, we have a multidimensional program here today. We have an audience here in the Opera Center. We also have students from 2 universities. The total group of universities participating in this program is 6, but 2 of them are not on spring break at the moment. So we have students from the University of Houston and students from Florida State University, whom we are delighted are continuing to study for the betterment of the world around us. Thank you for that. We've talked about the development of the libretto, about the creation of the piano vocal score. We've talked about the orchestration. But today I want to talk about the realization of the production that was enjoyed enthusiastically by audiences at Houston Grand Opera last week. So we're not alone with Carlisle today, but we have a whole team. I'm delighted that stage director Michael Gilletta is with us, someone I've known a long time, and so nice to have you here on the stage of the Opera Center. Shoko Kambara, the set designer for the production, and via video link from Salt Lake City, Gregory Gale, who designed the beautiful costumes for the opera. We're going to be talking about the way these creative artists interact to bring a new work to life. I have a number of questions, but questions may come from the students at the 2 universities who are with us by remote link. We're also delighted that this entire episode is being live streamed to all those who are curious to watch the series, and I'm very pleased that when I was in Houston walking around the Wortham Center, there are a number of people who stopped me and expressed their appreciation for this series that they have been watching on our live stream. So it's just terrific that you're all with us today. Before we talk about sets and costumes and stage direction, I just have to ask Carlisle, how did it go? Were you happy with the production?
Couldn't have been more pleased, really. Everything that I hoped would happen, happened. And the audience response was beyond any that I would have dared to hope for. So I have nothing but good feelings.
Were there any surprises? Did you discover things about the opera in the rehearsal period that you hadn't anticipated?
Not really. Not really. I mean, I was fascinated to see what Michael was going to do, as well as Shoko and Greg in their particular areas. And I suppose that's the area of greatest surprise, because these costumes, which took a great deal of time in doing, were certainly one of the great hits of the evening. And also, Michael's very, very careful staging, and remarkably, what am I trying to say? I mean, it was very, very beautifully done and intricately done. That's the word I was looking for.
Did you make any changes in the opera in the last couple of weeks? Any word changes, any note changes in the last week?
No, we were trying to get the parts to coincide with the conductor's score.
It's always nice when that happens.
Yes. And I think we did that. At least I was not aware of any errors in the orchestra. And they had ample time to learn the score and ample rehearsals. So it was a special orchestration designed for that particular pit of 25 players. And so I was extremely curious to see how that would play out.
And were you happy with the sound that you heard in the theater?
Well, I wasn't entirely happy, because it's a much smaller sound than I am accustomed to. But it was the sound that I contracted for. And I must say that I got more used to it as I heard it several times. When
opera companies do it in larger facilities, will they add strings to it? Will you?
I would hope so.
Okay.
Yeah.
How fascinating. Now, of course, we saw it beautifully realized in every visual and directorial dimension. But Carlisle, I want to start with you. When you are creating the libretto and then composing the music, how much do you see it theatrically? How much do you feel the movement of the characters on stage? Do you have a sense in your mind of what it looks like?
Not really. I suppose at the time, if anyone asked me, I probably could sum them up. But I certainly, in doing the libretto, I have a stage picture in my mind. I mean, I can't do, I don't think, an acceptable libretto without that. So that I'm writing the libretto to coincide with what I actually see inside here.
Do you put any of that into your score of, character A kneels in front of character B and says, "I love you"? Do you put stage directions into your score at all?
Yes, I do. Rather extensive. And I did that from the beginning of my career for one reason. There are a lot of not terribly competent stage directors who do it nonetheless. And also, I feel that it will be a help to them. And for the really professional stage directors, they don't need what I say. But at least it gives them an idea of what I'm seeing at the time.
So you're creating a directorial safety net in the event that the
very well put. Yes.
if the production is in the wrong hands, at least they have some basics.
They have some guidance, yeah.
How did you and Michael get together? How did Michael come into the project?
Well, he came to see me in Florida after he had been engaged by Houston.
So you were engaged by Houston, not having met Carlisle?
I think I was auditioning for the part, and I think Carlisle very kindly thinks I was already hired by Houston. No, but I was suggested to Carlisle, and luckily I was in the States doing a play at a time. I flew over for a day's visit, and my understanding, Carlisle, was that I was actually auditioning for the role of the director for this production. So lovely as it was, I was very much aware of the fact that, you know, there's a lot of talent out there, a lot of people who would kill to be in to take, you know, something like that on. So I came with high hopes, and luckily I passed the test. So
absolutely. I thought it was a huge advantage to have a Brit staging it. I mean, because it's an English subject, and I think it paid off handsomely.
How much of the opera was composed, if any, or the libretto, when you two met in Florida?
The libretto was pretty much in its early draft.
That's right.
And as Carlisle often said, that a lot of music was in his head. So some of the themes were already developed, and luckily I was spending quite a lot of time in the United States over the last 24 months, as you probably know. So whenever there was a few days off, I would come down to Tallahassee, and Carlisle would play bits and pieces to me, or I would bring some of the stuff that I meanwhile researched or found, or whatever development there was to be had between Gregory and Shoko and myself. So something that I keep going back to in my recollections of working on this is that we made sure there was a quality time spent between us and between us. And of course that's a commitment, because very often you think, well, I have a choice between having a working session or having a weekend off, but then jobs like this don't come up very often.
What does quality time mean?
It's a very good question, Mark, because it's the time when you can immerse yourself in the imagination of a living composer, or we can sit and talk about color or do a brainstorming session, as in how about, and cut all the weak ideas and then ring back across the ocean once again and say, you know, this was absolutely a stupid idea, let's kill it. But the development, something that being rushed, whether it's even rushed in the appreciation of the piece. You mentioned stage directions, but so much of what Carlisle has written is realized, as you know, after seeing the piece, through music, music without words, through setting an atmosphere, and you just have to immerse yourself in it. You know, I'm lucky enough to be a pianist myself, so once the first piano vocal score, right, I could just, but you know, so much of what directors do is about an interpretation of the material, and can you interpret anything in a rushed, quick, non-reflective way? I cannot. So the fact that I could come down every couple of months to Tallahassee and say, Carlisle, why did you put it like this? Or am I correct in thinking that, ... And I knew that was luxury, because very often...
Was the quality time about the production, meaning the set design, the costume design, and the direction, or was the quality time even about the opera itself?
Both.
So that there were suggestions out of this process about the shape of the opera itself?
Well, you know, it's a lot of time you spend banging your head against the wall. Why did the author put it like this? And the author is turning in his or her grave or not. But the luxury here was that I would say, Carlisle, why did the character express himself or herself in that way? And Carlisle would give me an often cryptic answer, which then I would have to take back home and think, what did he really mean? But that's, you know, that's one of the privileges of working with a composer who is out there. But also, from the beginning, Carlisle, I was stunned by how highly practical you were in the theatrical ways. So even up front, Carlisle would say, I wrote all this music in order to have a scene change or costume change, and if you don't need all of this, we can, you know, trim it or not. I ended up using most of the music because I just liked it so much, and I tried to find a pace in which the music could be realized visually on stage. And I think the set lent itself very well to it, as did the costumes.
Did any of these sessions, Carlisle, make you think at all differently about the shape of the opera or the length of a scene or the tinta of the scene? Did these sessions, working sessions, change the opera for you at all?
I don't think so.
Okay.
They simply made it more detailed, and the more we worked together, I think I began to have a much more graphic picture of what it would probably end up being like.
Mm-hmm.
Because what Michael does is very vivid, and what he had in mind, he fortunately he's a stage director that can talk and express himself very vividly, and that was a huge advantage all the way through.
Yeah. So, Shoka, how did you come into this? And in the introductory video, I actually heard Gregory say that Michael approached Gregory. So I'm kind of curious to know how the team got assembled.
I was the last person, I think, on the team, right? Oh, no, lighting, I guess.
Yeah,
afterwards.
yeah.
But I think they had. We have the same agent, so we got introduced that way. But I had actually met Michael 2 years ago, and we were like, "Oh, we should find a project," and then we walked away and thought that's nice. And then
we also worked for a few companies together, so we gradually became aware of each other's work.
Yeah, and what was the really lucky for Gregory, me, and Michael was that last May, before we were all due in Houston, we were all in St. Louis working at Opera Theater St. Louis. So I was on Barbara of Seville, Michael and Gregory were doing La Rondine. And so speaking of quality time in our and versus vacation time, we would, there's 4 shows, we're looking at the schedule, we'd find our common days off, and then we would meet and talk about this show. And I just think, even if we were just, I feel like one evening we were sort of talking about the show, but mostly just eating. But I think it's part of
Quality time. Really.
Quality time. Like, we need to know each other's rhythm and like how
I think of it as a sort of learn each other's language of references.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
so much of I'm sure you have so many directors, and Greg does, who say something, and there's that moment of what exactly do they mean, what is their expectation, what is their,
I've had directors say, Shoko, I just have to tell you one thing, I really hate purple, but I'm colorblind, and I don't really know
what do you do with that?
Yes.
What that means, and so you need this time to kind of know each other's.
And Gregory, how did you get to be a part of the team?
Well, Michael asked me, and then I jumped for joy.
So did Houston Grand Opera say, Michael, what costume designer do you think would be good for the show? So Houston spoke to you about the possibility of Gregory.
So the Houston asked me to propose who I think would be the right team for the project, and with Greg we did 2-3 productions together. So with Shoko it was our first collaboration, but as I said, it seemed that all the components were in the right place. Generally, Mark, it's a larger question concerning how opera companies prefer directors coming with a tried and tested team, which on the one hand, of course, makes things much more practical. On the other hand, if you want to achieve work that is exceptional, new, daring, then you don't want to do the tried and tested. But I think from the impresario's point of view, there is a certain element of risk. There's a possibility that this could have been a disaster.
Yeah.
Because now we know, but we didn't know 6 months ago. So, but you know what I mean? There's a possibility, and I very often think about the managements, the opera houses. How much risk can they accommodate? But then how do you create exceptional work if you just do what is safe?
So, Shoko, I want to ask you, because when it comes to stage direction,
Yeah.
I sort of kind of get it, and Michael can hit me later, but the text will tell me whether someone is walking toward one person or away from another person. You know, when someone says, "I'm leaving now," I know that they're exiting. How do you look at the text or listen to the music to begin to visualize what it's going to look like on stage? Is it from the text? Is it the sound of the opera that guides you in what it's going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, you know, usually I listen to it and I read the text, because the text has a lot of clues, like I don't know, I'm sick of sitting down, so which must mean they're in a chair, you know, or like I need to go somewhere. But in our case, actually, we didn't have a recording.
Right, I was going to follow up with that.
So it was sort of just musically just based on trust.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I trust Carlisle, I trust Michael. So then I had the text. You know,
I think it was still being developed,
the
because I
text
remember
was changing, yeah.
because part of my role, at least how I saw it, was doing some dramaturgical work on the libretto that Carlisle created. So there were things, for example, concerning the timeline of a few scenes, and the stage direction suggested we were continuously going on, and the text would suggest that we've moved on time-wise. Yeah. It may seem just a word change, but for Gregory, for Shoko, that means different look, different light, different setting. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, like, is it later that day, or is it tomorrow, or is it, you know?
Because if it's tomorrow, it'll be a different costume.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And we need to light it differently, and we probably need to reset the props, so that because this room will look differently at 10 a.m. tomorrow, you know what I mean? Which means that we need a break, or we need some sort of lighting change for somebody to do something, for something to change, unless, of course, we are stuck in some sort of Beckett-esque world where we have two guys in a tree and they say they're going somewhere and they never go anywhere. But that's a different kind of theater.
Yeah, you know, it's so interesting because you do your own libretti, which means that you are alone with your characters, you are alone with the opera. And suddenly you have these articulate, talented people coming into the world of your opera. And what's it like to let them take it and begin to run with it? If they're not running with it, they're walking very fast with it. to take it away from you and start to interpret it.
Well, I've never thought about it as taking it away from me. I feel like it's extending me. And what they do is particularize. And that's a very big part of it. And it's something that you don't necessarily do as a librettist, except in vague terms you say what the setting of this scene is. But the particulars of that, that's what I relied on them on. And it was a wonderful experience in that regard.
Because you have been alone with this creative process, and
boy, have you!
Absolutely. You know, in your studio, we've seen images of it working by yourself, and suddenly your opera world gets crowded with other people. But you welcome that. You welcome that transition.
That, yes, absolutely.
But you know, Mark, on that note, I remember, Carlisle, we were sitting at breakfast in the hotel during the rehearsal period, and I think we both realized how lucky we were that there was that link and trust, which of course was fostered by going back to the quality time together, because we really made sure that Carlisle knew what we were doing with the piece. And it may have been mentioned that there were different budgetary constraints. As Gregory said in the introduction, it's a very elaborate period, and of course one could, you know, the visual folly could continue because you could do anything with that period.
Let's pause there for 1 second, because doing it in period costumes at some point was a choice. Because this piece although, yes, the presence of women playing men's roles is particular to a part of the 17th century British theater. But conceptually, I suppose one could have directed it differently so that it wouldn't be in period costumes.
Yes, but then of course that would kind of slightly be contradictory to, I think, how you visualize the piece. And secondly, one would be stuck with the historical dimension. What do you do with all the named characters in a particular moment in the British history? Of course, as you say, Mark, there could be another level of meta-theatricality added to it. So and at some point that idea was also introduced, what would happen if it was a group of young American singers putting on an identity as they put on an onstage identity. But you know what I mean? I think that, you know, interesting as that concept would be, that would actually require a lot more rehearsal time, which of course budgetarily translates into thousands and thousands, because if you want to have that level of, you know, as you know, the really interesting work theatrically interesting work that European companies do. Well, let's take the E&O. It's the development period, all that workshop stuff that allows that level of experimentation. If you have 4 weeks to put something new together, then as a director, you have very little room for experimentation. I mean, the set is built practically by the time you start the rehearsals. So a lot of these decisions are taken, as you know, months or years in advance.
So, Carlisle, as you were creating the piece, your concept was that it would be in period costume.
Absolutely, yes.
And communicated throughout the team. And Gregor, you explained briefly in the introductory video about the constraints that you have, how to make it accurate from a period point of view, how to make it operatically lush, I think is the word you use, but not to make it comical. So tell us a little bit more about how you realized that in this opera.
Well, I started with Michael and Shoko, and we had started the idea that all of it was a very straightforward period approach. And then we took a twist that what we ended up with is that the entire company is in a period correct costume base that is entirely black. And then when someone becomes a character, they add pieces on top of this base when they become that character. So we do have this theatrical twist to it that also really ties into Shoko's set. I think it comes together really nicely so that we have a cohesive feel, but it also has a modern vibe to it, which I believe also goes with Carlisle's music. So we were trying to get at something theatrical. We also, at some point, decided to take the onstage Othello sections and made those their own, gave them their own look. All of that was hand-painted, etc., to look like a set of rep costumes that this company has used for many years. So we had a couple of different layers on top of each other to help us tell the story.
Let's talk about the revolving stage, because certainly when you were creating the opera, you weren't thinking, oh, a revolving stage will deal with this. And yet you did create an opera that had a number of different scenes, short scenes.
Yes.
So how did the turntable idea come into the mix, because it is such a part of the show?
Gosh,
You know,
I don't remember. Well, I mean, we
Okay,
had,
so-
a long time ago, we had things. We used to have more. We had more
yes, but you know, I think where it all started with is the composer's equation, which he gave to us as the creative team, is the relationship between the onstage audience and the onstage performers, because it's the chorus watching the performance and singing, you know, applauding the performance through their with their voices. Then we have onstage auditions. So you have, you know, characters in the story auditioning for the characters in the story. So
we
I
always
think
needed a stage.
an angle.
Yes.
We
needed
always
an
needed
angle.
a stage on the stage.
And we needed the theatrical audience either upstage of that stage or sideways of the stage so that they could sing and watch. And I think, Shoko, that's playing in your studio. That's what I remember doing, the angles, because of how Carlisle wrote it.
That we wanted to be, we wanted to be backstage, we wanted to be in the house, we wanted to be, and ultimately, I mean, when we were first thinking about it, I think the rotation just gave us different perspective. But then when in running it, I think we also realized that the rotation gave us a sense of time, change, a time change, like a location change, like we went far away, or we would rotate it really slow, or and sometimes we would rotate it and it would end up in the same place, but it just gave us a sense of change of venue. Or
now, when you're creating the libretto and writing the opera, do you think to yourself, I'm creating a real puzzle for that director and that designer because there are X number of scenes and time lapses? Or do you just create it as you feel the work, knowing that these talented people will solve the puzzle?
I rely heavily on that, yes. Absolutely.
But do you think to yourself at certain moments, this isn't going to be easy to stage in here, but they'll figure it out? Or are you not aware of where it's going to be difficult to stage?
Well, I think if you had asked me at in a scene, is it going to be difficult to stage, I could have told you precisely. Because it's a question of how much time has to pass, how much of which I didn't know at the time, but what's the furnishings on the stage, what they're going to look like, and how much effort is there in changing scenes. This device that they came up with, the turntable, just made that a great deal simpler. So that I had more freedom with what I wanted to do in terms of changing sets.
In terms of all the costumes, which are spectacular, and costume changes, were there moments where you really had to think, given the amount of music Carlisle's given you, how do you get these characters into different costumes?
Yes, certainly. Part of it, when we came up with this base costume idea, I knew that would certainly make things more fluid and make the changes quicker. It also opened up Michael's world for how he staged it, moving from on stage, off stage, time sequences, etc. So that idea bought us a lot of freedom, I should say.
There's a good question from Florida State University that I have here, and whether you have your concepts of costume set, scene changes, chorus, but when you bring the real singers into it, do you suddenly have to adjust again because what you thought of conceptually doesn't work on the people, or they just have different skills, different energies that you have to adjust to? How does that work?
You see, energy is one thing, and that's something that can be worked upon in the rehearsal room. The physicality of the singer, of course, is a bigger problem. And with Greg, we, social media and the fact that you can Google anybody and see them in another production costume is extremely helpful. And I can only empathize with the colleagues who worked in the past where that was not possible, because there are very few surprises. So we know that we're dealing with a singer of a certain shape or a certain physique, and then what do we do? So, and with Gregory, we have done quite a lot of time just thinking how those two people will look together, because sometimes an opera house casts an amazing, say, a couple of singers. It's just the only thing is that the lady is very short and the gentleman is very tall. And then you know that putting the two of them standing on stage will not look good. So then, of course, I know in advance that there'll be some kind of visual adjustment which translates into how we do this, how we do that. The other aspect is if in your mind or in the music it's a richly physical scene, and you're dealing with a singer who doesn't have that energy, depending on what kind of setup you have, whether you have a movement director or whether you have a choreographer, because very often your skills as a director can be supported by, if you're dealing with a good choreographer, you just say, get them into their bodies. Right? But if you're on your own, as pretty much with this production we were, it was basically what one can do in the rehearsal room.
Because this was largely performed by the artists of the Houston studio.
That's right.
Wonderful singers. It's one of the best studios in the country. But you didn't have an opportunity to audition broadly.
No, and I flew over to see their scenes, which they presented in September, because it's challenging in the opera world at the best of times, having the same people in the same room who trained in different countries and different languages, and their idea of good theatricality, of taste, of subtle acting can be so different, But if you take emerging artists who don't have years of, the practice, that's even more challenging. So I flew over especially just to see them, and seeing little scenes from Figaro and from whatever they did, Péléas, Mélisande, and I could see what the challenges were with each individual that I saw. And one of the obstacles that we came across was, of course, the language, because if you have a non-native English speaker playing a great actress or a great actor, well, mind you, as you know, theoretically one comes across it all the time, because a lot of people who sing Puccini are not native Italians. But of course, this opera is partly about language and about acting and about Shakespeare, about characters. So we knew that extra effort had to be made in some departments, and in a way, the director's job is to accommodate that.
Did you compose the opera for this specific group of singers?
No.
So you composed the opera the way you wanted it to be sung.
Exactly.
And the wonderful singers of the Houston Opera Studio were able to realize your work. And we'll just consider Joey Evans one of those young artists. I hope he's listening. And okay, so that in the next production of this, it could be an entirely different set of singers and what they bring to it musically. And if you are remounting this production, an entirely different experience in terms of energy and physicality.
Yes, I think there's a sort of ripeness in which is one of the most enjoyable things you can experience as an audience member, when you see an artist at the top of their skills, and that moment of ripeness where you know that it will never get any better. This is the tipping point. And the same way we were all wondering what would this piece sound like with lush orchestrations that Carlisle originally had in mind. The same thing, what would be if those parts were interpreted by people at that moment of perfect ripeness. Same thing as, we could only imagine what it would be like with the full scale sets and costumes, which I think we did a minimalistic version of it for whichever reason. It worked. It's a wonderfully engaging piece of operatic theatre. And I think it was perfect for this young group of artists who all did, remarkable work.
Carlisle, at certain points, did you pull Michael aside and offer your thoughts about what was working or not working from a directorial point of view?
I don't think so. We saw a great deal of each other because we lived in the same hotel and took meals together, and so it was a constant source of conversation. I think that's where so many of the ideas were aired and resolved, or at least explored.
So the collaborative nature of opera was completely realized in this collaborative teamwork to realize the premiere production.
Absolutely.
What is the role of the producer in all of this? So here, Houston has an idea about Michael and makes sure that he auditions for you. And then Michael has some latitude to talk to a scenic designer and to a costume designer. does the producer act as a mediator at times, or does the producer check in to make sure everything's going okay? What's the role of the producer in this?
Well, I've worked with I've worked with a number of producers, and generally we talk generally, but it depends. If you work with a producer like David Gockley, with whom I've done 6 or 7 operas, it's very easy because he comes to me only when there's some kind of something to be solved, or a decision made about a cast member or a member of the staff. But in one case, for instance, which I thought was marvelous, he gave me a list of 10 top directors in this country for my opera Cold Sassy Tree, and he says, take your choice of these. Then his work is really done when I make my choice, at least in terms of casting the stage director, which is such an important decision. Because with the new work, that stage director has to be able to work with me too, and that's a different situation.
And you presented your model and costume designs to the producer to say, this is what we're planning to do. Multiple times.
I mean, so that they can always, I mean, just even in the early stages, you show them, because if they don't, if they don't like it.
I think we contractually it works that we get preliminary presentation, which I think gives the producers and in this case the composer, an option to raise the red flag and say what exactly are they doing, and then you do the final presentation, which in our case turned out to be the pre-final presentation. We basically had to redesign the piece because even the first minimalistic take it became impossible for the company to realize. And say, Shelko, Gregory, myself, we're used to theatrical producers who focus on one production at a time, whereas of course if you're dealing with a big rep house, they only give you the attention that they can because they're dealing with 20 other productions. So that of course made the process a little bit uneven from our perspective, simply because decisions were made with some sort of delay, which is what to be expected of a big, busy cultural organization. But we all had to be lateral in our thinking, simply because at this economic climate, very often choice one is not the choice that companies can realize. And that's just the reality of finances in the arts these days.
I wanted to remind the students at the University of Houston and Florida State University that we welcome your questions if you have any. We also welcome questions from anyone in the room. Please feel free to raise a hand and we'll take your question and ask our team here. In terms then of where the opera in this production goes from here, so is it like having a child and sending it off to college where, okay, you have created it and you have guided it through its infancy and it has now been born and graduated onto the stage of American opera. Do you in a way say farewell and see you at your Christmas holidays? What's your relationship ongoing with the opera?
Well, I still feel very personally connected to this one. It took 3 years in the making, and I had a lot of concerns about it, personal concerns, because it was something very different for me. So I still feel attached and to it, and this production with these very gifted people was almost the ideal production. I think a bigger budget would have allowed for a different kind of production. But this production was so imaginative, and the period was suggested so well in terms of costuming and sets that I would want to see the next production pretty much in the same vein, or show me something equally good, if different.
Is it difficult for the designers to find common ground? And certainly there's a color palette both to the physical sets and to the costumes. Is that something that you had to really arrive at? Who led that, the entry into this rather dark color palette?
Well, I know that one of the things that happened to me was that when you were talking about producer involvement, so obviously budget is a big one, and the design I had turned in initially was too expensive, was still too expensive. I changed it. It was still too expensive, and I remember calling Michael and saying, Michael, I don't know what to do. I think I finally got it to budget, but I'm afraid that I might just have a whole bunch of burlap on the stage, and I don't know what we're going to see. And if I need to think cheaper, then, well, obviously one of the things that's really cheap is to use house goods, which are black. I mean, it is black. So then I feel like Gregory and Michael and we started talking about black as a color, partly because it was, in my department, free. I mean,
Well, yeah, Gregory had this idea of using that base, and again, I think that's where I remember having one of the critical meeting at Gregory's office down the road, and we suddenly, and Gregory reassured me that if we were doing a play rather than an opera, all of that late decisions and that minimalism would be fine, because a lot of theatre relies on black boxes and black bases to which you add, in opera we're more used to larger pictures. But because I think we're all well heeled in the theatrical matters, that helped us just feel confident that's fine. Minimalism is fine, and let's make it an artistic choice rather than a poverty-stricken necessity.
Right, because actually the whole black thing, and then it led me to, well, from the beginning I had all this research of 17th century Dutch still life paintings, and remember from the beginning we were looking at these beautiful paintings, and once we started talking about black, I went back and to those, and obviously those paintings are mostly black, and it's about what the light is reflecting off, pieces of brass, pieces of a flower, or maybe like a dead swan or whatever it is, but you just see a little bit, but the reality of that time period too is that it's quite dark, and it's murky, it's dark, it's dirty, it's candlelit, and so I think all of that sort of added into,
Well, it's a fascinating process as the opera comes to life, extending the collaboration further and extending the life of your creativity into the realization of the production itself. I just love listening to how it worked and how clearly you found that wavelength to make such a successful production. It was really wonderful to see it. Let me turn again. Jane, question from you? Do we need a microphone for Jane for the live feed? Okay, I will restate the question.
I was lucky enough to see it and see all of the pieces come together well. You keep speaking of the turntable, which in fact was a very, very large rectangular box. Was there ever a time when you were thinking in terms of an in-stage turntable, or was this always that fabulous freestanding piece, which I thought was
because you always needed a stage, so you had to have something that was a raised platform in a way.
But also, from the beginning, we wanted to not to have high-tech stuff. I mean, we even, I had this kind of strange pulley in the corner, partly because it seemed wrong to have things fly in, which seems like such a modern theater gimmick. So to see where it was coming from was important to us. And then the same way, I think that turntable, like if it was like, I don't know, I keep thinking about Les Mis or something with that, it would have been not right for us.
Yes, because I think once we wanted to evoke what that theater would have been like, you know, and with the rags, with the costumes, and we researched into how makeup would have been applied and removed and what those dressing tables would have looked like. You know, once we went for something that wanted to be organic, then of course an electric. I mean, we're still using revolving, you know,
I think there's a
electric lights and whatever. So there's a degree of hypocrisy, of course, there. But I think we wanted to evoke that world in the most evocative or organic way possible.
And you know, and what's funny is actually, now that I think about it, I even designed these. There's these holes in the corners so that you could put a pole in it and like walk it. Walk it around so you didn't have to like hunker down, but something about that pushing seemed right.
Yeah, it's
like the rougher it was, the better it was for us.
And I have to say that I cannot be grateful enough to the support that was given from the stage management and the assisting the directing stuff within HGO, simply because so many of the ideas that Shoko is talking about are what if, and if you have the clock ticking and the rehearsal period is what it is, and you don't have that sort of support stuff, you run out of time very quickly, and that's it. So even if I have a composer at breakfast in the hotel telling me, I don't like it, this has to be changed, you get to the point where I'm sorry, but this is an orchestra stage rehearsal, this is not mine, all I can do is sit and take notes. So had it not been for the support that we were given in the props department, the costume lot, makeup, people who are all willing to go the extra mile, and partly it was Carlisle because of yourself and the way people respond to your work and how dedicated they are to rendering your work in the best possible manner. Without that support given within the organization, we probably, let's move it like this, move it like that, would just not be possible.
We learn from this what a complicated art form it is, and that I think one of the reasons that opera is such a spirited art form is because it requires such a high level of collaboration. So many talented people working together from beginning to end to realize the piece, from that fundamental collaboration between words and music to the collaboration among the great designers realizing a vision in front of an appreciative audience. It is wonderful to hear it revealed to us in this way, and I know we could go on. We got off to a bit of a late start today because of some technical problems, so I'm going to have to end it here, but I know that Carla will happily, and Michael and Shoka and Gregory as well, take questions from those who are here in the audience live. Again, we are absolutely thrilled to have this opportunity to follow the gestation of the opera. Our next and final installment is on April 15, so we hope that you will be back with us in person or via live stream for the last installment of this Master at Work. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.